Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. This is episode 41, and we're going to talk about Nigel Farage, Bud Light, Russia, and choice. Yes, these are all related topics. Before we go on, I will say that I will start looking for a better microphone. Yeah, well, I just got a job. So since I'm no longer teaching at the university, I had to find another job to help me buy food for my family. And so I just picked up a job. I'll be teaching junior high. So going from teaching college to teaching junior high, that would be a kind of interesting change. But at least there they won't hassle me for the things that I say in class. Anyway, so Nigel Farage, if you haven't been keeping up the news, he is someone from England. I don't know all of the details of his life, but suffice to say that he's kind of pro-capitalist. The few times that I've heard him, he seemed to be very pro-freedom, which is all capitalism is freedom. Anything not free is not capitalism. He was a leader of the Brexit movement, which is basically the movement to get England out of the European Union, the EU, and it was successful. But of course, once they got the Brexit, he left the movement. He said, okay, time for me to retire. And I believe the Brexit sort of has not really progressed a whole lot further. In other words, there's a lot of foot dragging, a lot of special interests that built up relationships and special privileges by being in the union. They're upset while other people are trying to break free completely of the EU, and they have to hash out all the proper legal government interference that will take over life moving forward. In any case, he had an account, a bank account at the bank Coutts, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, Coutts, and it said that he didn't have enough money. He didn't have the minimum amount to open an account there, but apparently he had an account there for quite some time and often did not have the minimum, and no one really cared. But apparently there must have been a change in the leadership, and he was booted. It is said that he tried to open an account at 9 other banks, and they all told him his money was not welcome there because of his politics and his beliefs did not align with those of the bank. And so he's pro-freedom, and the banks are pro, ESG, DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, and the whole climate change stuff. And because they said his public positions went against their views of inclusivity, I don't know if the irony is lost on anyone, but because he's not inclusive, they're going to exclude him. That kind of contradiction, hypocrisy, I think is kind of amusing. But since a lot of people are exercising this idiocy with no shame, it's actually kind of dangerous. So they even went so far as to calling Farage a racist, a xenophobe, and a former fascist. Well, so he's not a fascist anymore, but he was. And one might argue, is he really any of these things? Because one should be kind of suspicious, because if he really was a racist and a xenophobe, I don't think he'd be able to live anywhere. But obviously these days, it doesn't really matter what subjective perspective you're going to take. You just try to take the worst perspective, portray it as being true, and then everyone else kind of believes it because they want to believe it. A couple articles I read about the story. This one article was calling the bank hyper-capitalist. And I think it's that abuse that I've been talking about over these episodes of having really sloppy definitions. So if a capitalist is freedom, basically pro-freedom, then hyper freedom? And if one is hyper pro freedom, would you exclude people from banking at your institution? And it's kind of funny because in one part of the article, they're calling the bank hyper capitalist, and Farage is just, I guess, a regular capitalist. And so if you're not a capitalist, or you believe the rhetoric that people are spewing these days, and capitalism is the symbol of all things evil, then basically the bank still evil, Farage evil. So there are no good actors in this play that we're observing. Now, and obviously all of the language is designed for people to side against Farage and still hate the banks, right? And all of this, as I just said, sloppy definitions, racializations, sloppy racializations, categorizations, generalizations, which leads to basically little clarity. So first we should look at Nigel Farage himself. He is a person. Okay, he's kind of famous. Maybe he's not uber wealthy, right? So the minimum balance he had to have was £1 million, which I guess is like just over $1 million. One might say, oh, so he's rich. Well, I mean, if you consider that the other customers at the bank had hundreds of millions of dollars, then Farage is really, in comparison, relatively speaking, not that rich. But he's an individual, right? And so people who have more than him don't care about Farage because they have way more than he does and they have other things to think about. Most people who are lower income, they don't care about Farage because they wish they had that much money. So basically it becomes a problem of the rich and famous, right? So lower income people probably wouldn't care so much about it. And so perhaps it's for these reasons that the bank thought that they would be able to get away with it, right? Maybe they were caught up in their own sense of self-righteousness that they pulled this stunt where they would kick out sort of a somewhat well-known person out of their bank. And it says that he tried to look for another bank. He tried 9 other banks and they rejected him, right? So in free market world, he should have been able to find another bank. And I think if he tried hard enough, he would. I mean, what small bank would turn away £1 million? But again, here's the problem. I don't know too much about British banking. Someone else I listened to who podcasts out of England, he seems to say that there are not that many banks, although I might be getting it confused with Canada. Oh, Canada's even worse, but I think he means to take a stand. Like, look, this was just wrong. Why would you kick a customer out because you don't agree with their politics? It's a bank, and banks should only care about money, right? And taking care of the money. One might argue that because of the way that central banks work these days, and how they're basically propping up all these bankrupt banks, insolvent banks, that now they can take these political positions and mistreat their customers, because even if everyone left, the government would just simply print more money and prop up those banks, essentially them becoming zombie banks. Now, the thing is so it appears to me that I think he wants to make a point, and he can afford to. And in my head, a little bit, I like to think that he's doing it for people like me who don't have that much money, who would not be able to get away with it, right? I would just be crushed by the system. And so one might think maybe he's doing it for us. He's an individual. And remember, I said that the smallest minority is the individual. Apparently, Ayn Rand said it first, but because my focus was race theory, I worked it out, got to the same conclusion, by means of a different road. Nevertheless, so normally an individual would just be able to switch banks. But as we just said, he tried 9 other banks and they all said the same thing. So essentially what's happening is that there are fewer alternatives. And maybe it's also like, why would all these banks say no to £1 million? Maybe it's because the government is leaning on the banks in England, just sort of like the way the government leaned on Twitter, Facebook, right, Instagram, and made it so that they did their bidding. And so if they wanted someone blocked or banned or censored or what do you call it, deprioritized in some way, they just did it. And so perhaps you have government agents in these banks whispering in the ears of the CEOs to make sure that they all do the same thing. They all have the same, maintain the same line. And I wouldn't blame them. After 9 banks, they all say no. You're like, okay, that's it. Forget it. I'm going to make a point. Right. So there's that. Now, normally a bank, if they kicked out a customer because they didn't like what he said, well, you see, the bank would have to pay for that. Right? There is a cost. There are consequences for kicking out a relatively popular figure from their bank. And of course, these days, because of all of the shenanigans that the government has done, most people are afraid of doing certain things. Also, most people don't have that much money in the bank. And so there's no way for people to launch a protest against a banking organization because, you would require many, many people in order to create a problem for the bank, like a solvency issue for the bank. So, but in a free market type situation, and if margins are kind of thin, right, the difference between solvency and insolvency is very, very thin, then banks have to be very careful about how they treat their customers, right? So that would be the thing. So normally the Nigel Farage situation would be a non-issue. One bank kicks them out because they don't like what they said. Okay, so he finds another bank, sets up shop there. He lets all his followers know that the other bank, right, Coots Bank in this case, kicked him out, and so all of his fans would drum up the negative propaganda, and Coots would be in danger of becoming insolvent. Right, that in a perfect world, that's the way it would be. So that's how the market would be able to protect people like Nigel Farage, the minority of the individual. Okay. All right, let's talk about another individual, Dylan Mulvaney. And I talk about him not because I want to talk about Bud Light. I told you I don't drink alcohol, but it is a very interesting story where Bud Light, the company, decided to use Dylan Mulvaney, a transgender spokesperson, to speak in a marketing campaign for Bud Light. I'm not sure if it was the actual content of the commercial or the anti-trans sentiment among certain people, whatever, but there was a boycott of Bud Light. And so Bud Light, I guess, was one of the top selling light beers, which is basically, I guess, watered down regular beer. But anyway, fewer calories, whatever. You don't get, you slow down the alcohol intake kind of thing. But in this couple of stories that I read about this, they kept saying that the only people who are boycotting are right-wing people. But given how bad the sales have gone down, right? It's almost like no one's buying, but you can't give it away kind of level. It's not just the right wing, right? So it seems that a lot of people who drink, unless of course 95% of people who drank Bud Light were all conservatives, so-called right wing. I find that hard to believe. Just remembering in college, it didn't seem like there was a political determining factor in terms of what you drank. It was more about budget, right? So anyway, so there's no real need for politicians to enter into this debate. You have a company that decided on a marketing campaign. Its customers did not like it and stopped buying the product. That is all you need. And so the business then is faced with a decision. Do you continue the campaign, or do you say, oh, I screwed up, I'm sorry, and then you go back to the way things were before. And so the reason why this is because Bud Light needs to convince people to drink their stuff. There are other light beer companies. I don't know. I guess it's like sort of Coke and Pepsi. I guess people can tell the difference in the taste. I guess I don't know. But because there are other beers to drink, Bud Light has to make a lot of effort to ensure that people continue to buy its product. And sort of to double down on Dylan Mulvaney or to support him, defend him, or whatever, be slow to react. I think basically encourage people to say, yeah, I can just switch beers. There's very little price difference. The taste pretty much the same, so whatever. And then the ball started getting rolling, and then a lot of people just stopped drinking Bud Light. And so there it is. The company was punished for its behavior. Now, why was it so easy? So, lack of a better word, why it was a lot easier to pull off this attack against Bud Light and not so easy with the banks, right? Well, one might argue about the scale of the money that's involved. Sure, we can do that. But I think the one other problem that we need to remember is that the government monitors banks more closely than beer companies. I don't know how things are in England. I would imagine that's very similar to here in the United States. But in the United States, the government requires all banks to snoop on their customers. And so if a customer deposits too much cash, they are obligated, right? They are obligated to report that to the government. And so in other words, the government had passed all these regulations, particularly through the Patriot Act, to spy on their customers for the government, right? And so the banks become agents of the government. I don't know if England is like that. And so that's the problem. One cannot escape this spying, this snooping by going to another bank because it's there as well. And so when the government controls an industry, an aspect of the market, there's no place to hide. And we can see that this is not just in the national level, but also on the global level. And so the United States, because it has the world reserve currency, they weaponized it against other countries, but particularly against Russia. Now, the simplistic explanation is that reserve currency means if you want to buy anything from another country in the world, you have to use dollars, right? So you buy dollars from America, and then you use those dollars to buy stuff from other countries. Very simple, right? Explanation, but just to give you a sense of why dollars are really important. So Russia has a lot of dollars. And then when the Ukraine war started, the United States seized all of their assets, right, that were located in other banks and just basically stole from Russia. And one might say, well, that makes sense because Russia is really bad. But consider that during World War II, all of the accounts of Germany were not touched, even though they were in other countries, right? And that I thought was kind of interesting. I never knew that. And it's because finances were always sort of sacrosanct, right? They were sacred, and so therefore separate. You don't mess with bank deposits. I don't know. There's probably something else there too, but I don't know enough to comment on it. But I do know that the consequences of the United States weaponizing the dollar, right? Punishing countries if they don't do what the United States tells them to do by withholding dollars from that country. That's what the economic sanctions are all about. A lot of countries were like, okay, we got to get out of this system. We don't want to be basically controlled by the United States in this way. And so we can see some of the effects, right? The BRICS banks started, and whether or not that's going to be successful, I don't know. There are a lot of different opinions. Rafi Farber basically expresses his skepticism, although at the same time, if they can pull it off, hey, awesome. But because of the way the current money and the way the financial system is set up, everything has to go back to gold and silver. So if you look at it that way, then whether or not BRICS will be successful is it depends on your subjectivity. The economy of the EU was affected by what the United States did to Russia. Also, it drove China and Russia together. The Russian economy is stronger now than it was before the war. So all of these things are consequences of US banking activity. Just a note, just in case you didn't know, but the United States bought a lot of oil and gas apparently from Russia. And when the war started, they made the point to say, yeah, we're not going to order from them anymore, which they didn't, but they were still using Russian oil and gas because they did it through India, right? So they got India to buy it, and then they bought it from India, which basically means everything became more expensive as a result. So these are all consequences of financial decisions on the part of the United States. So in conclusion, over the last few years, we just continually see a reduction of choices and options available to us. And it's because government is getting bigger. It's intruding into more and more aspects of our lives. And all of the activity over the last few years, if you've been following the stories, new research studies about the safety and efficacy of lots of, prescription-related things that are inserted into your body, right? It turns out that it's subjectively bad, right? It's not very beneficial. More people suffered, and there are more negative consequences than if nothing was done at all. And more are coming out. Excess deaths, blood clots, health complications. I know someone who, as soon as right after they got what was mandated, all kinds of health issues. She got shingles. All of her teeth just started rotting. It's terrible. I feel really bad, but there's nothing I can do. But it's very, very coincidental that it's because of that medication that she took because she was required to. So the solution to all of this is more freedom, less government, so that there would be more choices, more freedom of movement. Businesses would be held more accountable. They would have to think about their policies much more carefully, unless they do another Bud Light mistake. Normally, I think banks would be falling over themselves to get Farage to do banking with them. But I think there's that government element, right? Just like in the United States, all the banks are somehow under the control of the US government. And so it might be like that in England as well. But in a free market, the customer is always right? And so you cater to the needs and desires and wants of your customers. And so the customer is always right unless you have the backing of the coercion of law. That's it for this episode, and I will talk to you in the next.